Harper Fields didn't expect her entire life to shift while standing in line at the post office. But then again, she also didn't expect the tall, frustrated man in front of her to look completely lost, holding a stack of international forms upside down. "You're filling out the customs form backward," she said, gently tapping his elbow with the corner of her manila envelope. He turned, startled. Up close, he was even more put together than she thought. Black coat fitted perfectly over broad shoulders, his jaw sharp, eyes clear and stormy gray. His confusion melted into a sheepish smile. "Is that why the woman behind the counter looked ready to murder me?" His voice was deep, smooth, but with something guarded in it. Harper chuckled. "That, and probably because you've been holding up the line for 10 minutes. He looked around and winced. "Right, I'm not great with paperwork." She stepped closer, taking the form gently from his hand. "I used to work at a shipping place during college." "Customs forms were my jam." He handed her a pen. "Then I owe you a coffee or 10. I'll settle for not having to watch the lady behind the counter burst a blood vessel." They shared a laugh, and she helped him fill out every box, asking questions with practiced ease. He answered smoothly, carefully, never saying too much. By the time she was done, he was looking at her like she was a miracle. "I never got your name," he said as she passed the form back to him. Harper Fields." He offered his hand. "Ford Ashbourne," she blinked. "That sounds like a name out of a spy novel," he laughed, a real one this time. "I get that a lot." They didn't leave the post office until the clerk gave them both a look that could kill. Outside, snow was beginning to fall lightly. Harper zipped her coat up and turned to him. "Well, good luck with your package. You saved my life in there," Ford said. "Let me buy you lunch." She hesitated. "I don't usually go to lunch with people I meet in federal buildings," he grinned. "Come on. Worst case, I'm a boring guy who doesn't know how to ship things. Best case, I'm a boring guy who buys you really good food." She bit her lip. Something about him wasn't adding up, but not in a bad way. He was dressed like money, but acted like he had no idea what he was doing. Still, she didn't feel danger. She felt intrigued, all right. One lunch. They ended up at a French cafe nearby. He ordered confidently in French, and she raised an eyebrow. "You don't know how to fill out a customs form, but you're fluent in French," he shrugged, eyes twinkling. "We all have our skills." He didn't ask any of the usual first date type questions. Instead, he asked about her job at the tiny flower shop she managed, her art degree, her dream of opening a gallery one day. He really listened, and when she spoke, his eyes never left hers. "So what do you do, Ford?" she asked finally, halfway through her croissant. "I own a few things," he said vaguely. "Mostly companies. I travel a lot." She tilted her head. "That's not an answer," he smiled, sipping his espresso. "It's not a lie, though." She narrowed her eyes, amused. "You're mysterious." "Am I?" "Yeah, like you're running from something." He paused, just for a second. "Maybe I'm running to something." There was another beat of silence between them. It wasn't awkward, it was heavy, charged. Harper hadn't felt this drawn to someone in years. And that scared her a little. After lunch, he walked her back to her apartment building, even though it was out of his way. "Thank you for helping me today," he said, standing just outside the door. "It's not every day I rescue a stranger at a post office," she teased. "Can I see you again?" Harper hesitated. Her last relationship had ended badly, a guy who'd promised forever and bailed when things got hard. She wasn't exactly eager to dive into anything, but Ford, he wasn't like the others. There was something real in his eyes. "Okay. But next time you're filling out your own form," he laughed. "Deal." They exchanged numbers the old-fashioned way on a napkin, and he left her with a glance over his shoulder that made her heartbeat stutter. For the next few days, Harper tried to focus on work, but her mind kept drifting back to Ford. Who was he, really? He'd been vague, but not in a sketchy way, more like he didn't want her to see him a certain way. Like he wanted her to know him before knowing what he had. She didn't hear from him for 3 days. Then on Friday, he walked into the flower shop like he'd always belonged there. "You found me," she said, surprised. "You wrote the name of your shop on the napkin. I figured I'd skip texting and show up instead." Her heart flipped. "Well, that's bold. I like seeing your face when I talk to you." He helped her rearrange a display of peonies, awkward but charming with the petals, and by closing time she was laughing so hard her cheeks hurt. He was less guarded now, telling stories about growing up in Boston, how he hated suits, how he once tried to surf in the Hamptons and nearly drowned. She still didn't know what he did. But when he looked at her like she was the only person in the world, she didn't care. That night he took her to dinner, not just dinner, a rooftop restaurant she'd only seen in magazines. The kind with a string quartet and views of the skyline that made her breath catch. Ford didn't make a show of it. He didn't brag. He just pulled out her chair, ordered wine without looking at the menu, and told her she looked beautiful like it was the only truth that mattered. "Ford," she said gently once dessert came. "Who are you?" He leaned back, watching her. "I'm just a man who got lucky once. And now I'm trying to figure out what really matters." She studied him. "It's not the money you're hiding, it's the reason you have it." He didn't confirm or deny. Instead, he reached across the table, taking her hand. "I know this is fast, but I haven't felt this way in a long time." "Maybe ever," she swallowed hard. "You don't even know me." "I know enough to know I want to." Harper looked down at their joined hands. Her heart was racing, but not out of fear, out of something that felt dangerously close to falling. "Then don't disappear again." "I won't," he said. "Not unless you ask me to." The next morning, he was waiting outside the shop again, coffee in hand, smile soft, and that was the beginning. Harper had never been invited to a black tie gala before, let alone one held at a private estate with valet parking and an entrance lined with fire-lit lanterns. But that's exactly where she found herself the following Saturday evening, gripping a gold-trimmed invitation with her name printed in elegant script and trying not to hyperventilate in the back of a town car Ford had sent. She hadn't agreed immediately. When he showed up at the shop 2 days prior with the envelope, he didn't pressure. He just handed it to her on top of a bouquet of calla lilies and said, "If you're curious, come. If not, I'll still be by for coffee." Now, she stood outside a mansion that looked like it had been carved out of old money and whispered, "Curious it is." The man who opened the door greeted her by name, leading her inside without hesitation. The entryway alone had ceilings taller than her entire apartment and chandeliers that shimmered like stars. Everyone was dressed like they belonged in a fashion campaign's sleek tuxedos, silk gowns, polished shoes. She suddenly felt like a child playing dress-up, even though Ford had insisted on sending her a gown from what he called a friend's boutique. It had arrived in a box tied with navy ribbon, along with a pair of heels that fit so well she wondered if he'd traced her feet while she slept. She was halfway across the marble floor when she spotted Ford. He wasn't in a suit. He was in a tuxedo that looked tailored to his every breath, bow tie crisp, watch glinting just beneath his cuff. He looked completely in his element, confident, poised, as if he'd been raised among champagne towers and orchestras. But the second he saw her, something shifted. His posture relaxed, his expression warmed, and he moved toward her with a quiet urgency that made the world tilt. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, voice low as he reached for her hand. "I almost didn't," she admitted. "I had a minor panic attack over the dress." He glanced down at her, eyes lingering. "You're breathtaking," she exhaled, tension slipping away in increments. "You could have warned me this was a whole situation." "I was afraid you wouldn't come if I told you the truth." She raised a brow. "Which part, the tuxedos or the fact that every person here looks like they own a yacht?" He didn't answer. Instead, he led her to a quieter corner of the room where the music was softer and the crowd thinner. "This isn't a party," she said, watching servers float by with crystal flutes. "It's a gathering of the 1%, Ford leaned in. "It's a charity event. I sponsor it every year. My assistant usually handles the details, but I insisted on coming this time." "Why?" He looked at her, expression unreadable. "Because I wanted you to see this side of things, the real one." She stared at him. "So this is who you are," he hesitated. "It's part of who I am." "But it's not the part I wanted you to know first." Before she could respond, a woman with silver earrings and a voice that carried interrupted them. "Ford, darling, there you are. Everyone's wondering where you've been hiding." Ford's grip on Harper's hand tightened slightly. "I've been right here." The woman's gaze slid over Harper with a sharpness that wasn't quite hostile but far from kind. "And who is this?" Harper stepped forward before Ford could speak. "I'm Harper. I manage a flower shop." "And I'm the reason he didn't mail his package upside down." The woman blinked. Then, to Harper's surprise, she laughed. "Well, that's refreshing." Once she was gone, Harper leaned toward him. "You didn't tell me your friends belong to royalty." "They don't," he said. "They just act like they do." He guided her outside to a terrace overlooking a private garden lit by discreet lanterns. The air was cool, scented faintly with jasmine and money. "I didn't mean to throw you into the deep end," he said, hands resting on the stone railing. I didn't want to lie." "But you did withhold," she pointed out. He nodded. "Yeah, I did." She turned to face him fully. "So what's the truth, all of it?" He looked at her then, really looked. "My name is Ford Ashbourne. I own a venture firm that invests in tech startups. I inherited a ridiculous amount of money when I was 23. I've been trying to make something meaningful out of it ever since, not for anyone else, for myself, so I can sleep at night." Harper processed the information slowly. "And the post office?" "I was sending a package to a school in Senegal. We fund their science program." His mouth twitched. "I wasn't lying when I said I sucked at forms." She folded her arms. "Why not just tell me all this the first time?" "Because I've seen what happens when people hear the number. They start acting differently. I didn't want that from you." He paused. "I still don't." She stared out at the garden, her thoughts a tangled knot. "I'm not mad at the money. I'm mad you didn't trust me with it." "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You're right." They stood in silence for a moment, the city lights glowing in the distance. "I don't care that you're rich," she said finally, voice steady, "but I don't want to be someone you impress. I want to be someone you're honest with." Ford turned to her, his expression open in a way she hadn't seen before. "Then I'll give you honesty every time, no more hiding," she nodded. "Okay, but for the record, that tuxedo makes it really hard to stay mad." He laughed, the sound low and genuine. "I'll try to wear something less charming next time." When they returned inside, the music had shifted to something slower. Ford offered his hand and Harper took it, letting him guide her to the dance floor. They moved together like they'd been doing it for years. Her hand on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, close but not overwhelming. Intimate. "I've spent a long time building walls," he said into her ear, "and you walked right through them like they weren't even there." She rested her head against his chest. "Maybe that's what happens when you stop hiding behind them." Neither said anything else. They just danced, the rest of the world dissolving around them, replaced by the quiet rhythm of something beginning, something honest, something real. The first time Harper saw Ford's world in daylight, it wasn't at a gala or a rooftop restaurant. It was on a Tuesday morning, when he picked her up in a car that looked like it belonged in a museum exhibit and drove her out of the city without telling her where they were going. "Is this a kidnapping?" she asked as the skyline faded behind them. "That depends," he said, glancing sideways. "Are you the type to scream or negotiate?" Harper leaned back in the seat, amused. "I'm the type who makes you regret not packing snacks." He didn't laugh, but his expression softened in a way she hadn't seen before. Less polished, more thoughtful. They drove for over an hour, winding through tree-lined roads and passing vineyards and horse farms until the car turned down a long gravel path flanked by stone pillars. "What is this place?" she asked, eyes narrowing as a sprawling estate came into view. "It's where I go when I want to remember I'm not just what I own," Ford said. "Come on, I want to show you something." He led her past the main house, a stately building with ivy crawling up the walls, and out to a field behind it, where a weathered barn stood in the middle of a golden clearing. When he pushed open the door, it wasn't hay or horses inside. It was a sleek, open space filled with canvases, some half-painted, some blank, and others leaning against the walls. A wooden work table was covered with brushes, jars of pigment, and a few old sketchbooks. Harper stopped in the doorway. "You paint?" "I used to," Ford said, stepping inside. "I started again last year. It's the only thing that shuts everything else off." She touched one of the canvases gently. It was unfinished, but the brushstrokes were decisive, emotional, raw. "Why this place?" My mother used to bring me here when I was a kid, before everything got complicated. He paused. She was the one person who never cared about what I could buy. Harper sat down on a bench near the window, pulling her coat tighter. Is she still around? No, cancer. Years ago? He didn't look at her when he said it, but his voice carried the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. She left me this land, said it was the only part of our life that hadn't been touched by ambition. Harper didn't speak for a while. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was respectful, honest. Why bring me here? She asked finally. Because the way you look at me isn't based on what I have, he said, walking over to lean against the wall. And I needed you to see that I'm still trying to hold on to that part of myself. You're allowed to have money, Ford, she said. You just don't have to let it decide who you are. He looked at her like she'd said something he'd been waiting his whole life to hear. Paint something? She whispered. He hesitated. Now? Yes, for me. Ford picked up a brush without arguing. He didn't ask what she wanted. He just started moving, sure and quiet. Harper watched the way he worked, focused, deliberate, like he was building something from his own bones. When he stepped back, she stood and moved beside him. It wasn't a portrait or a scene. It was abstract but not chaotic, a swirl of color and motion and something almost vulnerable beneath the surface. It feels like you, she said softly. He didn't answer. He just dipped his brush again and added a single gold streak down the center. They stayed in the barn for hours. He painted. She sketched. They didn't talk about business or money or expectations. They just existed in a space untouched by the rest of the world. When they drove back to the city, it was dark. Harper leaned her head against the window, watching the lights blur past. Can I ask you something? She said. Anything? Do you ever get tired of pretending you're okay? Ford's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. More than I admit. But I've spent so long being a version of myself other people expect, I'm not sure how to stop. Then maybe start small, she said. Like letting someone in who doesn't need you to be perfect. He didn't respond right away, but when they reached her apartment, he didn't just drop her off. He parked. I don't want to just date you, Harper, he said, voice low. I want you to know me, all of me. She turned in her seat, meeting his eyes. Then stop saying things like that in the car and come upstairs. They didn't sleep together that night, they talked. On her couch, wrapped in a blanket with a chipped mug of tea between them, he told her about the first company he ever invested in and how it collapsed. About the brother he hadn't spoken to in 3 years. About the therapist he saw every other Thursday. She didn't flinch, didn't judge. She listened. When he finally fell asleep with his head against her shoulder, Harper ran her fingers through his hair and whispered, You don't have to keep proving anything. The next day, she found a small canvas on her kitchen table. It was her, not a perfect likeness, not a posed version. Just her hair tied back, eyes soft, sitting on the floor of the barn with a pencil in hand. There was no note, just the painting. When her best friend Eliza dropped by that weekend and saw it, she raised an eyebrow. Is that you? Harper nodded. Did he paint it? Yes. Eliza studied her. And how exactly did you stumble into a man who paints like that and drives a car that costs more than your entire building? Harper leaned against the counter. I helped him at the post office. Eliza blinked. You're kidding. Nope. Do you even know how weird your life is right now? Harper smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes because something was shifting. Ford was opening up, letting her in. But the deeper she fell, the more she started to wonder what would happen when the rest of his world, the world she'd only seen glimpses of, decided she didn't fit. And worse, what if she didn't want to? She didn't say any of that aloud. Instead, she picked up the painting and hung it on the wall. Right above the table where she kept her sketchbook. The invitation arrived on a Thursday, delivered not by courier but by Ford himself, who appeared at the flower shop just as Harper was closing up. He leaned in the doorway, coat damp from the rain, holding a navy envelope sealed with wax. No tuxedo this time, he said as she slid the key into the lock. Just dinner. She eyed the envelope. What's the occasion? I want to show you something you haven't seen yet. Not the money, not the paintings, just something that matters to me. She slipped the envelope into her coat pocket. You're making a habit of not explaining things. If I told you everything up front, he said, stepping closer, you wouldn't have a reason to keep discovering. She laughed, but it caught in her throat when he reached out and tucked a damp curl behind her ear. His fingers lingered for a second longer than necessary. "Tomorrow night," he said. "I'll pick you up at 7. He didn't bring a car the next evening. He brought a motorcycle. Harper stared at the sleek black machine gleaming under the street lamp, then at Ford, who stood beside it holding a second helmet. "You didn't mention I'd be risking my life tonight," she said, crossing her arms. He offered the helmet with one raised brow. "You trust me?" She hesitated, then took it from him. "You're lucky I'm wearing jeans." The ride wasn't terrifying, it was exhilarating. The wind rushed past them as they sped down the coastal highway, city lights giving way to open stretches of road that curved along the cliffs. Harper clung to Ford's back, heart thudding, not from fear but from the freedom of it all. It felt like leaving the world behind. Eventually, he turned down an unmarked lane that led to a small, weathered boathouse tucked near the edge of a rocky cove. He parked the bike and helped her off without a word. "There's no one here," she said, pulling off the helmet. "That's the point." He unlocked the door, revealing a narrow staircase leading down. She hesitated. "Is this where you keep the bodies?" she asked. "You're not funny," he said, but his eyes glinted. They descended into a small, hidden room built into the rock. Inside was a long table set for two, candles flickering in glass lanterns, soft music playing from an old radio in the corner. A chef she recognized from a cooking show stood behind a portable stove, already plating an appetizer. Harper turned slowly, taking it all in. "This is not what I expected. No staff, no photographers, no menu," Ford said. "Just you." "And me." She stepped toward the table, running her fingers along the edge. "Why here?" "I used to come here in the summers, before the money, before the meetings, before I forgot how to just be." He paused. "I never brought anyone here." She looked up at him, surprised. "Why me?" He sat down, watching her with a quiet intensity. "Because every time I think about what I want my life to look like, it started to look a lot like this, and that scares the hell out of me." They ate slowly. The food was exquisite, but it wasn't the point. The conversation drifted from childhood stories to books they'd loved, to places they wanted to see. Harper told him about her dream of opening a gallery that didn't just sell art, but taught it, offering workshops to kids who couldn't afford supplies. Ford listened, not with interest, but with investment. "You could do it," he said, pouring her another glass of wine. "I could help." She shook her head. "That's not what I'm looking for from you, I know, but I want to." She leaned back in her chair. "Then promise me something. If you ever do help, it's because you believe in the dream, not because you want to buy your way into it." "Deal," he said. After dinner, they stood outside the boathouse, the moon casting silver across the cove. Ford reached into his jacket and handed her something small and folded. She opened it and found a sketch rough, done in pencil but unmistakably her. Laughing, head tilted back, unrestrained, "I drew it the morning after the barn." "You've never shown anyone this part of you before," she said, almost to herself. "No, and I didn't plan to." He stepped closer. "But you make me want to stop hiding from everything." She looked up at him. "You're still scared," he nodded. "I am, so am I." He hesitated for only a second before leaning in and kissing her. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was the kind of kiss that felt like a decision, slow, deliberate, and full of things left unsaid until now. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers. "I've fallen in love with you, Harper." She closed her eyes, breath caught somewhere between her chest and heart. "Say it again." "I love you." She opened her eyes, and her voice came out quieter than she expected. "I love you too." They didn't rush back to the city. They stayed in the cove until dawn, wrapped in blankets on the weathered dock, fingers intertwined, the ocean whispering promises below them. A week later, Harper came home to find Ford waiting on the steps of her apartment. He stood as she approached, holding a single envelope. "This isn't just another dinner invite, is it?" she asked. "No," he said. "It's the lease agreement for a space, corner of Mercer and Fifth, big windows. High ceilings. You mentioned it once, months ago, in passing." She stared at him. "You didn't?" "I didn't buy it," he said quickly. "I secured the lease in your name. For the first year, after that, it's yours to run or walk away from, no strings." Her throat tightened. "Why?" "Because I believe in you," he said. "And because love isn't just saying the words, it's doing the work, it's giving without asking. She flung her arms around him, burying her face against his chest. "I don't want to walk away from any of it." "Then don't," he whispered. They opened the gallery together 3 months later. It wasn't just hers, it was theirs, though she insisted on designing every detail herself. Ford didn't interfere. He showed up on weekends to help paint the walls, brought coffee during late-night prep, and stood beside her on opening night as the first guests walked through the doors. When people asked how they met, she always smiled and said, "I helped a stranger at the post office." But when Ford told the story, he said, "She saved me, I just didn't know it yet," and that was the truth. Because beneath the wealth, beneath the title and the estate and the endless possibilities, he had been a man looking for something real, and she had given it to him. Without asking for anything in return, just love, all of it. The gallery had been open for nearly 6 months when Harper stood at the edge of the exhibit floor, barefoot on the polished concrete, watching a child dip their brush into a tray of watercolors with the kind of concentration that made the world go still. The Saturday art workshops had started with 5 kids and a folding table. Now there were 20 children every weekend and a waiting list that stretched into next spring. Ford leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, quietly watching her. When the class ended and the last child was picked up, he walked toward her, his shoes echoing gently on the floor. "You looked like you were somewhere else just now," he said. "I was," she replied. "I was thinking about how 5 months ago all of this was just an idea in my head." He reached for her hand, linking their fingers. "Now it's a part of the city." She turned to face him. "I'm still not used to people calling it mine. They should." "You built it?" He hadn't been involved in the curation or the programming by design. Harper had needed this to be separate from his name and his influence. He understood that. What he hadn't expected was how much he'd love simply watching her thrive. "What about you?" she asked, stepping closer. "You've been quieter lately." Ford exhaled through his nose. "I've been thinking about stepping back from the firm." Her hand tightened slightly in his. "Really?" he nodded. "I've spent the last 10 years chasing scale, growth, bigger numbers, higher valuations. But lately I keep wondering what the point is if I'm not building something that matters." She searched his face. "So what would matter?" "I want to start something new. A foundation, maybe. Something that backs creative programs in underserved schools. Art, music, writing. The kind of stuff that gets cut first when budgets shrink." Her eyes softened. "You're serious?" "I've already started moving things around. I want to fund the kind of ideas that don't get traction because they don't have profit margins." She pressed her forehead to his, grounding him. "You're not who you were when we met." "I know," he said, "and I'm glad." Over the next few weeks, the two of them fell into a rhythm that felt less like a routine and more like a shared language. Mornings started with coffee brewed in her tiny kitchen, the scent of oil paint lingering on the edges of her hair. Evenings wound down with him reading through grant proposals while she sketched ideas for the next community exhibit. They didn't talk about the future as a maybe anymore. It was embedded in everything they did. One night, as the first snow of the season fell outside her window, Ford asked her to come with him to Boston for the weekend. It was where he'd grown up, a place he hadn't visited in years. She hesitated. "Is it going to be difficult?" "Yes," he said. "But I want you there." They stayed at a modest brownstone near the harbor, far from the penthouse suites and luxury hotels he usually preferred. On Saturday, he knocked on a weathered green door and introduced her to a woman in her 60s with cropped gray hair and a voice like gravel. Her name was June, and she'd been Ford's childhood piano teacher. "He used to sneak into my studio at night to play," she told Harper, said the house was too quiet, too cold. Music was the only thing that made him feel like he belonged to something. That night, Harper lay beside him in bed, tracing her fingers over the scar near his collarbone. It was from a biking accident in college, and he'd only mentioned it once years ago when he'd still been learning how to talk about pain. "You're not afraid of where you came from anymore," she whispered. "No," he said, "because now I know where I'm going." The proposal came on a rainy Tuesday. Not a grand gesture, not a flash mob or fireworks. Just a quiet moment in the gallery after hours, surrounded by canvases and the faint scent of turpentine, he walked in, soaked from the storm, holding a small gray box. "I was going to wait," he said, "do something elaborate. But I realized the most honest thing I could do is ask you right here where you built your life." She stared at him, motionless. "Marry me, Harper, not because I can give you anything, but because I finally understand what I want, and it's not a life full of things. It's a life full of you." She covered her mouth with one hand, tears threatening to spill. Then she nodded once. Yes, they didn't throw a massive wedding. Instead, they held the ceremony in the converted barn where he'd first shown her his paintings. There were only 40 guests, friends, students, teachers, and artists who had become like family. Eliza officiated, managing to get through it without crying until the last line. As the sun set beyond the field, Harper stood with her hands in Ford's, her dress simple, her smile anything but. "You changed everything," he said, voice rough with emotion. "No," she replied. "You just started living the version of you that was already there." They danced barefoot on the grass, the sky streaked with lavender and gold, no headlines, no photographers. Just music, laughter, and the knowledge that neither of them had to run anymore. In the years that followed, they created a life that didn't need to be explained. The gallery expanded into a second location. Ford's Foundation funded over 100 arts programs across the country. They traveled, taught, hosted free exhibits. They argued about what color to repaint the kitchen and who left the cap off the markers. They kissed in grocery store aisles and slow danced in the living room during thunderstorms. And every year, on the anniversary of the day they met, they walked to the nearest post office and filled out a customs form together, upside down, not because they needed to, but because it reminded them of the beginning and how far they'd come.